All right. Abortion. What do we think about it? I don't have an actual audience, so I'm technically asking a wall right now due to unforeseen circumstances. But abortion is one of those topics that it's very difficult to talk about. It's hard to talk about it just because there is so much complexity to the issue, and our culture as a whole hasn't really approached the issue in a very complete way yet. It is very black and white, and that is it. There is only black and there's only white, and there is no... there's usually not there's a good and an evil. There's a middle between those. There is none. That's why I bring it up for my topic, which is critical thinking and argumentation. More emphatically, the psychological importance and necessity, almost, of critical thought and argumentation, and how they have a reciprocal relationship. It's very important to understand that they build on one another. I'll get into that later, though. So, to transition into my first point of critical thinking, what is critical thinking? Definitionally, it is the conscious process of assessing the validity of claims, evidence, and reasoning for the purpose of reaching a justified conclusion or decision. Even if you only look at that technical definition, you can see some validity to it. Why we should even bother. It helps us come to the best conclusions based off of evidence, based off of what we understand to be true fact. If you aren't going into a conversation with the hopes of coming to the best possible conclusion, you are not really going into a conversation. You're more so going to tell someone that you are right and they are wrong, or something like that. Or it'll be flip-flopped and they'll be coming in saying you're wrong and I'm right. When it comes to critical thinking, you can look at another positive aspect of it, which is problem solving. Problem solving and critical thinking almost can be interchanged as a term. There is a very strong connection between your ability to problem solve and your ability to critically think. It goes into the topic of IQ and that whole mess, which is another difficult topic to talk about. But it is important to realize that the greater ability you have to critically think, the greater ability you have to problem solve. Something that I think is even more important than more important than problem solving is critical thinking's ability to defend against ideology, which in the last year has become something that I've really realized is an issue that we fall into as humans a lot of time. Ideology is, if you look at the definition, a systematic body of concepts, especially focused on human life or culture. Really, it's a system that is based off of a moral code. If you want to see some examples, communism is an example of an ideology. It is based on the moral belief that equality is the ultimate good, effectively. It's a little more complicated than that, obviously. It's not a good idea to straw man, which is something we'll talk about later on. And then another form of ideology is, I use a cross here because it's what I'm most familiar with, but religion in general is a form of ideology. It's just a system based off of moral code. It is important to defend against ideology because no ideology is formed out of entirely bad motives. They all form from good beginnings. The reason why they become popular movements or get out of the stage of groupthink, which is another topic we'll talk about later on, is they have enough positive aspects that people are willing to accept the negatives. The problem with that is if you accept all the negatives, there are a lot of major downsides to that in a lot of situations. But beyond that, I want to talk about argumentation. Critical thinking is the internal dialogue on a topic that as your internal dialogue, where you use the information you know to come to the best possible conclusion. What argumentation is that external dialogue where it's actually back and forth between two different views and two different sources of information. To understand argumentation, we have to know what an argument is. An argument is a claim supported by evidence and logically sound reasons to accept it. Argumentation then is the combination of two or more arguments, two or more opposing views that are coming in, and there's dialogue surrounding it. Argumentation can be broken up into two main core topics, main core styles, I should say. Deliberation and debate. They both have their own use case. The use case changes, and it also, they never can work fully. You can never only deliberate, and you can never only debate. They both have use cases. Debate, an example of a useful place to debate, is something like in sports with, let's say, Michael Jordan versus LeBron James. That is a topic that you can't say there are two greatest of all times. You can't, by definition, by title. There is not greatest of all time. It's why it's such a fun topic to debate on SportsCenter or whatever. I talk about it all the time because there isn't a right answer in this particular case. There are a lot of cases where debate is actually, there is a right answer and a wrong answer. Usually just don't think of it as debate because it's more like just an open dialogue. And people accept defeat or whatever it is, or accept that they are on the side that actually has the most evidence. When it comes to argumentation, I wanted to talk about this book right here. Is, I lost my actual cover, so you can't see the nice fancy art, but it is 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. It's a Jordan B. Peterson book. He's a tenured professor at the University of Toronto. He's a psychology professor. His main focus is, the main focus that I know of him is his focus on Jung. Carl Jung. It's kind of depth psychology. It goes into it looks at not only the positive sides, it looks more so into the negative aspects of the human psyche. It's a complex thing. You have to know a little bit of information for it to be useful. But in this book, he also is a clinician, a clinical psychologist. He goes and helps people. He's done it, I think he had done it for 30 years. Very well versed and fairly well cited as a researcher as well. Rule 9 in his book is assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. The reason why I think that is such a valuable topic to bring into this conversation of argumentation is everything is a debate if you don't come into it with the intent of learning something. If you don't come into it with the intent of coming to the best possible conclusion, if you believe you know everything in that area that you're debating or arguing on, there will be no progress. And I find that progress in thinking is a very important part of growing. It's a very important part of growing, like as a society and as a culture and as a political government. Ideas need to be able to evolve and change. I think that if you go into it without the wanting to learn something new, it's more of a fight than it is a conversation. One part that will lead into our next topic is the advantage of verbal argumentation actually increases your ability to critically think, which is something that I don't think is very well known. Most people think best verbally. They think best by speaking. A lot of people don't write. I think writing is probably an extremely strong source of critical thought. It's actually, there is no systematic way to increase critical thinking ability, but there is an association between writing ability and critical thinking. And so verbal speech works about as effectively as writing on your critical thinking ability. This goes into my next point, which is the important reciprocal interplay between critical thinking and argumentation. It seems like almost a redundant point, but the reason why I point it out is it's important to realize that they build off of one another. The more you're able to the more argumentation you go through, the more material you have to critically think. You have more perspective. You have more knowledge to pull from in critical thought. And then you can take that critical thought and turn it into a greater argument. This is the way culture evolves. This is the way culture grows up. This is the way culture moves past dark eras like so much of our politics are focused on right now. If there is no dialogue, which as political polarization continues to be a more and more dangerous philosophy, we see it more and more that if there's no evolution of ideas, we stalemate and stall and fight and nothing but fight. That's a very dangerous line to walk down. The other major important topic that comes from this interplay is the topic of straw manning, which I brought up earlier. Straw manning is an intentional misrepresentation or misrepresented proposition that is set up because it is easier to defeat than an opponent's real argument. You see this a lot with, what would be a great example? You see straw manning a lot in politics, which is really sad because that's where it should happen the least. But you'll take a point, and I'll use the abortion example. In that dialogue, one side only sees it as killing a living being, and one side only sees it as a choice for the woman. It's a very dodgy topic, so I'm going to get off of it as soon as physically possible. But it's important to realize that it isn't only just it is a living being that you're killing, or it is just a woman's choice. It's more, there's more depth to it than that. It's like no one would recommend that their child gets an abortion. No one would do that. You wouldn't suggest it. But at the same time, there are many cases where it is more dangerous to not go through with something like it. Again, very complex topic. I don't need to go into it. I think that it requires some serious deliberation towards from both sides before we can even have a real conversation about it. I do think it is the abortion topic is in essence very important for our culture to understand, though, because it ties in with all these other hotly debated topics. Debated being the highlighted word there. There is no attempt to work together. Another major tie-in with that is back to Rule 9. Assume that the person you're talking to knows something else, something more than you. That was a botched version of it. But it is useful to always be gaining new knowledge. You get, what would it be? The more you are willing to go and argue a point and be wrong and accept that you're wrong and grow your base of knowledge, the more you'll be able to handle the world, more be able to understand the world, and more be able to, what would it be? Increase your base knowledge. It's useful, especially in the political realm. It's very useful for example, my mom is a librarian here in Lewiston, and she has to deal with topics that she's never had to deal with before. I don't need to go into the details, but the point is, if you say something that you don't understand, you don't know the depth of it, your job can be at stake, even if you don't think that you're doing anything wrong. This hasn't happened yet, thankfully, but it has happened in many, many, many places across the country. And so it's just going into an open dialogue with a viewpoint that you don't understand is very important, because, or a view that you don't side with, the opposing view, it's very important to understand where they're coming from. And this kind of leads me into my conclusion, which is, I hope that I expressed some importance of, and the necessity of, critical thinking and argumentation and how they work together. But one of the things that I wanted to leave off with, just end this with, is a quote from Fyodor Dostoevsky. He's, I think widely considered to be one of the greatest authors of all time. He wrote Crime and Punishment is probably his most famous work. Fantastic book, and this quote is actually from that book. Nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer. Nothing is more difficult than to understand him. I really think that in the particular case of that book, he's actually talking about literal murder. Makes it a lot more difficult to talk about. But the point there is that there are times when we assume that the other side is just evil. And there are very few cases where people choose to project their evilness. Nobody would side with a side just because it is inherently evil. I don't think there's any logic in that thinking. There are ways that very evil people do very evil things, as we saw in Nazi Germany, and we saw in Rwanda, and we've seen in Soviet Russia under Stalin and Lenin. We know that there are people that are out there to do not good. There are people that are out there not focusing on doing the best possible thing for humanity. So understanding those people makes us a lot more dangerous in dealing with those people from their perspective. We become a lot more serious of opponents if we understand the intention behind the other side. And I think that's very important. Especially in I've said this 10 times, the realm of politics. Really, it is a necessity that we focus on the ability to understand everybody. We don't have to like the opinion. We just have to know it. And I think that is overlooked a lot nowadays. All right, but that is it for today. All right, thank you.